So I have the pleasure today to welcome all of you, our Alberta Improvement Facilitators, to our introduction to the STEP document series, the supportive tools for every panel. Today, I'll be just facilitating the call, but today's session will be actually led by Mia Kavanagh, who's a clinic liaison with the Highland Primary Care Network. And she's also a member of the EQUIP team, the Elevating Quality Improvement in Practice team that we have based here in Calgary. So I'm not going to say too much more about that, simply because Mia is going to actually review with you a little bit about how Highland got started with some of this work and a little bit about how EQUIP came into that. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the floor over to Mia, and she'll be directing me today on advancing slides, etc. So over to you, Mia.
Okay, thanks, Laurie. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'd like to welcome everybody, first of all, just by myself personally, because I think everybody has to take time out of their busy schedules to come do stuff like this. And a number of us who are helping to put this out today are really excited about these documents and are excited to share them with everybody. So thanks again for coming. As Laurie will maybe hopefully mention at the end, just as a reminder, in case I forget, that we have a part 2 of this webinar, which will handle a different section of the activities next week. And so ideally, and I'll just look to Laurie to double check that if anybody has not had an opportunity to attend this particular webinar, they can likely get a copy of the recording and then jump on the one next week as well. Is that correct, Laurie?
Yeah, barring any technical issues, we do hope to have this up in advance of next week's webinar.
Okay, lovely, lovely. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is just tell you a little bit about how these documents came to be. There's a bit of an evolution and quite a bit of work that has gone into these, so I think there needs to be a little bit of a shout out to all the people who did lots of work on this. So the documents were a collaboration, really, between Toward Optimized Practice, Highland Primary Care Network, and the EQUIP team. And as Laurie said, the EQUIP team was sort of formed early in 2016, I think it was. Carrie, you can chime in and let me know if I'm incorrect on that.
Yeah.
And, okay, good. And Laurie and Carrie, please feel free to jump in if you think I'm missing something or maybe needs explanation a little further than what I do on the call. So the EQUIP team was sort of formed in early 2016, and there was really a need for us to come together and talk about ways that we could improve how we gather data in the EMRs and work with improvement facilitators and the challenges that we have with clinics and all those things. And of course, TOP-U, I assume you're all very familiar with. And of course, I'm from Highland Primary Care Network. So I myself have 20 clinics of my own that I look after. And so I am very passionate about this work. And I'm sure the girls would say yes, they're probably nodding their heads quite emphatically at that point. And I do get a little bit excited, so I'll try to rein myself in. So how it all started was that Highland had really had some internal conversations about wanting to define a structure around how we do paneling and screening activities across all of our clinics in the PCN. And so we were trying to figure out how we can take a common approach with that. And the other thing was that Highland specifically wanted to stratify the panel, and in our PCN, we have what are called POETs, and in other clinics, they may be called panel managers or PCCs. So you may have slightly different terminology depending on which PCN you're coming from. And we wanted to tie that work to our funding model. So those are the two things that we really kind of wanted to try and accomplish. And through some conversations with the person who I reported to, and Carrie was also saying that TOP in general was seeing a need and some comments from other PCNs that they were looking for something in sort of a similar fashion. And so it seemed that we thought we would sort of undertake a sit down at our table here at Highland and just sort of figure out what that could look like. And so in February of 2016, we invited Barb McCaffrey from TOP as well as Mark Watt and Carrie, and then it was myself and my boss at the time. And we sat down to kind of brainstorm what that could look like. And after several meetings and many, many hours, we came up with the activities that you're going to see in the document. once those activities were fleshed out, Carrie and myself brought the bones of those activities to that newly formed equip team. And then it started to evolve even further. So with a lot of collaboration from the 7 PCNs that are represented on the equip team, and also I think kind of uniquely that we were given a lot of freedom to me and to the rest of the team to sort of develop things further and say, okay, where could this go? And as a result, we now have the STEP documents. So I did want to give a little bit of a shout out to some of the unsung heroes at top who have also done an incredible amount of work to help out put these together. And that would be Lori Toma, Michelle Hane, and Shannon Horrocks. So I'm wondering, Lori, Carrie, did you want to actually comment on anybody else who I may have missed?
No, I think that's beautifully said. And lovely to be able to, if you're part of one of the 7 PCNs in the Calgary and surrounding area, you can be very proud. You were well represented by a member of your PCN. And also people who are not members of the Calgary and area PCNs, we did actually practice on you as well. We took it around the province to see if it resonated. So we want to thank you as well for those people that raised their hand and said, sure, come and use this tool with us. So thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. So with so many of you that are calling in today, and I think I see somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 on the call, that we're sort of expecting that a significant number of you are improvement facilitators or work somehow in that way. So we're sort of orienting today's chat and part 1 review to help you guide the clinics through the process of paneling and screening. So I'll be talking about the actual activities that are actually in the documents, but I just wanted to highlight not just the content, but also the various ways that the documents can be used by the facilitators, by the PCNs, and by the clinics themselves. So to jump in, actually, Lori, did you want to advance the slide on that? I'm just wondering if I didn't cover anything. So we talked about the evolution of the documents. I love how she did that, by the way. An ape to man with a little workbook in his hand. And the next slide, Lori? Perfect. Okay. So these sets of documents, you see 3 before you, okay? And what you're seeing is sort of the first page of each. So we have a checklist, and we have a toolkit, and we have a workbook. So just maybe to tell you a little bit, that STEP, that acronym, stands for Supportive Tools for Every Panel, okay? So, and you'll see that everywhere in the documents here. So we have these 3 documents, and I think there's a few important things that I'd like to point out before we even kind of dive into the content. So maybe, Lori, can you advance to the next one? Or, okay, perfect. I didn't talk about this. So the documents, as Carrie mentioned, as people were getting on the call, are now up live on the top website. And you can see here that if you go to Tools and Resources, and then Patient's Medical Home, and then Panel and Continuity, if you scroll a little ways down, you'll see some direct links for all 3 of these documents, if you haven't already seen them. Here. So you can get updated
I can
copies
actually,
of these documents at any time.
I can take us through live here as we go into the page. Hold on, I just need to move my control panel here. But the Patient's Medical Home, and here under Panel and Continuity. Our panel and continuity resources are all alphabetical, so you just need to go through here to the STEP documents, and you'll find them below. So just a little scroll there.
There they are, perfect. And so those are direct links, and you can click into those, and all of the updates are going to be, TOP has agreed wonderfully to house all of these documents and the tools, and so any updates or additions we have to these documents will actually be, frequently updated right here. So you always get the current ones there. Now, just worth mentioning, because we actually, when we started this, you'll see that Lori had gone through here. There's about a 2-second delay on when Lori is advancing the slides, and so if it looks like it's taking a second, that's actually normal. Okay, so next slide, Lori. Okay, so then what I would love to do is I would love to start with the checklist, Lori, if you wouldn't mind going into that particular one. Because I sort of want to springboard everything that we're doing kind of off the checklist, okay? Now, the checklist is sort of a summarized version of the toolkit and the workbook. So it's it's really important, what I want to say, and I'm going to point this out every single time we change documents, is that the activities that you see under the activity column are the same in the checklist as they are in the toolkit, as they are in the workbook, okay? So those activities actually flow through all three documents, okay? Now, you'll notice a couple things about the checklist is you'll see, and we're going to cover up the first page of this checklist. There is a second page on the reverse side, and we're going to do that in the Part 2 review of the webinar next week. So you'll see on the front here, it says panel identification levels 1, 2, and 3. And then along the left, you'll see some tick boxes. And above it, if you look really closely, it says yes. It says they're working on it or not yet. So as you go through this checklist, one of the things that I did is I took this checklist and I actually did a checklist for every single one of my clinics. And I did my own little sort of assessment on where I thought the clinic was at. So for each clinic, I would go on there and say, for that activity, yes, they can do that. Or for this next activity, they're working on it, but they haven't quite mastered it yet. And then third being not yet, meaning they haven't really kind of started that activity yet. Okay. So as I mentioned, you've got levels 1, 2, and 3, and levels 1 being, of course, sort of beginning activities, level 2 being sort of intermediate work, and then level 3 being fairly advanced sort of stuff to be working on. And often these activities will build on each other. So we want to build on foundational work as much as possible. So level 2 builds on things in level 1, level 3 builds on things in level 2. Now, the nice thing about the checklist is that you can really meet the clinics where they're at, because as most of us know who have spent time in clinics, it's really not really a linear sort of process. When you go into a clinic, you'll notice that, maybe there's, if you actually, when later on we have a chance to look through this, you'll notice that maybe they're doing like 3 activities in level 1, and they're doing 1 activity in level 2 and 1 activity in level 3. So it's not always exactly in order of, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So what we wanted to do is kind of structure a little bit, but allow you to have some flexibility to use it how you think would be best in that particular clinic. So we're going to try and meet the clinics where they're at any given point in time. The activities can be built on, but don't have to be linear. Okay? This is the checklist itself is a really quick reference for all the activities and the things that you will find that will be a little bit more fleshed out in the toolkit and the workbook. It's an excellent way to assess a clinic. So it really gives you kind of a state of the nation. Where are they at any given point in time? For example, my ED, she said, I'd really like to know where my clinics, what this clinic is working on right now, or how far along are they in their paneling. And really at any time I can bring up this checklist to her, and it's very, very clear, right? So there's not a lot of guesswork involved. And she's really operating from a point of view of having a lot of information about the clinic, right? So that's really helpful for her. The other thing is that you can sort of evaluate your clinic at regular intervals if you want. Every 3 or 6 months, you can pull this out, and you can say, okay, here's what we were working on a few months ago. We've been doing all this work. Now where are we at, right? And evaluatively, that's a great thing. I know that I've been hearing that there's a couple of evaluators and other PCNs who are really sort of looking to this sort of thing in the checklist in these documents specifically to do more evaluative work with the clinics themselves in the PCN. The other thing is that you can be transparent about what's happening at the clinic at all times. So you know where they're at, the clinic knows where they're at, your ED knows where they're at. Really, everybody is sort of on the same page. If they're not able to demonstrate one of these activities by producing the output, so I'll just explain that. You'll see on the left column is the activity, and then to the right of it is the output. One of the things that we wanted very much was to start creating a bit of either soft or firm kind of accountability to the things that we were doing with the clinics, right? So I'll give you an example. I would go into a clinic and I would say, okay, you guys working on your panel? And they'd say, oh, yeah, sure, we do that all the time. This is what we always do. And then if you say, okay, run me a list, all the people attached to, Dr. Smith. And they'd go, oh, I don't know how to do that. So some of the ability of the clinics to kind of demonstrate or show what they were working on was not always there, right? So we created outputs that were attached to each activity. And sometimes those the outputs are something that you just need to document? Like, have you guys had the conversation and wrote it down somewhere? Can you run a list or a search out of your EMR? Or, have you gone through the sort of the workflow process of identifying what you want to do? So it's all about what can you sort of demonstrate at the end of that activity. If you can't do the output, if you can't demonstrate what it is you're supposed to do in that activity, then ideally we shouldn't be checking them off as yes, that they can do that. They haven't really mastered it, because you want to make sure that they kind of really go through the process, right? Again, going into clinics, I would find I would talk to maybe, let's say there's 4 people at the front end and on reception, and you talk to 2 of them and say, well, do you guys do this? And they say, oh yeah, we do it all the time. And then later on, 3 months down the road, after we've sort of gone through some process, we realize that, the other 2 aren't doing the same things as the first 2 are doing. So sometimes there's some disconnects there that we want to be able to address. Okay, just those are some of the things that I use this checklist first, but I wanted to also point out some alternate uses of why we think this is a great document. So in a very quick sort of way, it sort of provides a lot of vision and a roadmap for the clinic to say, again, I'm going to try and give you as many examples as possible. So I've gone into a clinic and say, we're talking a lot about medical home right now, right? And if you had asked, to be fair, a kind of a vague question and say, how good do you think you guys are doing? Do you think you guys are really, advanced medical home? Do you think you're just starting out on the journey? And you'll either get crickets, right? They can't really answer that very well because it's kind of a vague question. Or they don't really know what is good versus somebody who's advanced versus somebody who's just beginning. What does that even look like? So if you go into a clinic and you do a quick assessment of this clinic, even just for yourself, and you notice that they've only got the first 2 activities checked off, then having conversations with them as a team and saying, okay, here's where you guys are at, but here's where I'd like to take you, right? Then they have some more tangible things that they go, oh, I get it. Okay, I understand that, this would be a more advanced activity than this one. So it gives them a lot more of a vision of where they're headed. Also, again, about the accountability. So in my PCN, for example, we tied a lot of this to funding. And I know of at least one other PCN that is going to be doing the same thing. And so for us, for example, we decided that we had levels 1, 2, and 3. So if you've got everything checked off in levels 1, then you get level 1 funding. If you are got all the stuff checked off in level 1 and 2, you get level 2 funding. Pretty simple and straightforward. I know that one other fellow who is in another PCN actually has assigned numeric values to all the tick boxes along the left-hand side. And so for them, it's more about the total score versus the levels 1, 2, and 3. So, maybe Carrie, I don't know if you want to chime in on this one, but what we liked about this is that we wanted to have a similar structure so that we could help guide clinics through the process in a very similar fashion, but still have the ability to kind of flex it gently how the PCNs might use it differently, right? Do you want to comment on that at all, Carrie, or is that sort of cover off?
Yeah, no, for sure. You've done a beautiful job explaining that each PCN is using it differently. They're using it for training purposes as well. So many people on the line perhaps have seen it now in their own training. So they're using it to train their poets or panel managers or PCCs, using it as a way to inform them on what the next training should include. And they're using it to train improvement facilitators too. So looking at the steps and saying, can I teach this activity? And you've done a beautiful job around outputs are really just, am I able to show that I can do this activity? So yeah, lots of different ways of using it. And even an executive director could use it to inform them around their entire, Calgary has such large PCNs and medium sized as well in the surrounding areas, where an executive director could even look and say, I wonder where my physician memberships are on the journey and how we can support them. And once they know what level they're at, they might be able to know what kind of resources they can provide. So yeah, it's yours to use. We'd be very happy to hear how you're using it. And I'm sure people will be super clever with it.
Great, thank you, Carrie. And I just wanted to expand, actually, you were talking about evaluating on improvement facilitator knowledge, right? So So identifying if there's any training needs or things that they could use to help them facilitate with clinics even better. Now, when we're doing this kind of work, there's really no bachelor degree or diploma program, ready to go training for improvement facilitator, other than what, as far as I know, what TUP provides in terms of their training. But a lot of the people who come into this role come from various backgrounds. So for me, my background is as an RN, but I'm also a chartered mediator. And so there are other people who come into this who have, really strong backgrounds, who come from, one of the TELUS vendor products, right? So they'll come from one of the fellows who I work a lot with. He, used to work at PS Suite before they got bought over by TELUS. So everybody comes to the table with some different skills. And so if you know that you have to handle some advanced activities with this clinic, if you're kind of just beginning to learn about how to facilitate clinics or what these activities are all about, then ideally, your manager, your ED may want to match the facilitator to the clinic depending on where they're at. So if you're a beginning facilitator, you might not want to put that person with an advanced clinic because you'll sort of feel like it'll be a little bit more difficult to kind of challenge them to move forward because you're already still learning about some of these activities, right? One last thing I wanted to mention too is that, for example, let's say I'm the only facilitator in my particular PCN, and if I win the lottery tomorrow, then maybe it might be that I go to Jamaica for 6 months. It would be really nice if whoever they bring in to follow in my footsteps could kind of pick up where I left off. I've seen a number of times in years past that people will leave their role, and then you have to build a whole brand new relationship with a person, and you have to spend another 3 to 6 months building that relationship and just getting to know them, and okay, where are you guys at, and what do we need to do? And so a lot of this information will be all documented for you, so you can pass it on to another facilitator, or if somebody's lucky enough to retire, then you can always keep the momentum of the clinic going. And everybody, again, it's very transparent. Everybody knows where they're at. Okay, so Lori, if you wouldn't mind going over to the toolkit. Okay. So the toolkit is about 12 pages, so it's a little shorter. It was originally meant to, I think the original thinking was that it was going to be more of like a facilitator guide, meaning that whoever was doing the facilitation would have more tools and resources at their fingertips. And so, Lori, if you wouldn't mind going in and maybe stopping on page 4. Just a small delay there while perfect. Okay, so if you'll notice, for anybody who's got the checklist printed out in front of them, the activity number 1 on the checklist, or these activities that carry through, is determine active patients that are attached to a primary care provider. So as you can see here, the activity on the left, exactly the same. Identify active patients that are attached to a primary care provider. So the activities and the outputs are the same as what you see in the checklist. Now, to the right of that, you'll see some links to some of the tools that are available. So what we have attempted to do anyways, and there's actually more tools forthcoming, in order to get the documents kind of out and available to people, we had to, kind of have a quasi cutoff and say, okay, we have to get this out the door. But the idea being that the tools here, you've got some links. So if you are taking a clinic through identifying active patients that are attached to the provider, then right here you've got 3 documents that you can refer to that will either that you can refer to as a facilitator, or the clinic can refer to and say, geez, we want to know why that's important, or we want to know how to do this activity to the best of our ability. And so in the future, we're going to be adding more tools. I think we've got at least between 3 and 5 on deck to go and be added in here in a very short period of time. But those will, again, be updated by TOP. And so as they become available, they will appear there with all the hyperlinks. So some of the things that you're going to see in here are things like existing documents that TOP already has, because they have some fantastic tools already. So for example, the top one you'll see here is the EMR Tip Sheets. And so for anybody who hasn't delved into those are a wealth of information that are specific to EMRs. So there's also some other sort of guiding principle, kind of work around medical home. What's some of the other things? There's an EMR data entry assessment checklist, So there's a whole bunch of things. There could be articles, it could be tools that were developed by other PCNs. So if anybody has something that they think, we use this tool in our PCN and this is fantastic and we get a lot of really great results out of it, then feel free to suggest it to the top team. And, maybe Carrie and Lori would be great contacts, and, me for that matter. But anybody who wants to send something in, please let us know, because we want to make this robust. And we want to make sure that it's we have as many tools as possible available to everybody, so that we can really share in our knowledge and our ability to help facilitate clinics with this work. So on the right-hand side, the very right-hand side column, you'll see patient's medical home assessment level. Now, I'm not going to delve into that too much because that's a bit of a separate body of work. But I just wanted to say that for anybody who has done any work on the medical home assessments, that these levels are directly linked and aligned with the activity that you're working on. Okay? So if anybody has any questions about that later on, we can always address them. But just know that that's kind of a separate piece, and not to get too worried about that, because it's something that you can do that is doesn't have to link into what we're doing with the documents today. Okay, Lori, let me just stop there for 2 seconds. Lori, Carrie, did you want to jump in? Anything I might have missed?
No, you're doing a great job.
Yeah, thanks, Mia.
All right, and if you wouldn't mind jumping to page 9 on that one. I'll let everybody on the call who goes through these documents will actually, have an opportunity themselves to look at this.
Sure. Just to ask that, so I have 2 pages up here at one time. Is the resolution okay, or do you want me to go to a 1-page view?
I think it's okay for me.
Okay.
Okay. So the workbook, again, I'm going to point out that the activities are the same. Okay. So what I just want people not to be fearful of is that there's so much content here that it will feel a little bit overwhelming, but I just wanted to make sure that everybody is really clear about that. So as you can see, activity number 1 here on page 9 on the right-hand side says identify active patients that are attached to a primary care provider. Okay, again, the same. So the purpose of the workbook was a few things. Is we wanted to have a place for the clinic to document their stuff. So because we were trying to create a little bit of accountability and to say, look, have you guys actually done it? Have you asked the right questions? Are you asking all the questions you're supposed to be asking? If you're facilitating, what are the things that you would be a good idea to cover off with them? So this gives you a place to kind of lay things down on paper. So for me, when I first started working on this, my thought was, you remember in grade 3 when you got your math book and everything was all there and printed, you just literally had to fill in the blanks? And that was kind of what I envisioned this being. And so for each activity that we have listed in these documents, the very beginning of it, the very top part, as you'll see, talks about sort of what are the questions that you need to ask, what are the important things you might need to cover off. In some of the more advanced things, there's a little bit more explanation about maybe why that's important or why that's going to matter, how that's going to impact other things. And then in the bottom half is an actual exercise or some things that maybe you need to fill out or document. So questions like, how is the provider attachment confirmed with the patient? So who is the person who asks the patient? Does everybody at the front desk it, or is it just one person? Is everybody asking the questions in the same way? Do you use a script? Is it documented somewhere so that if you have another staff member come in and you have a bit of staff turnover, are they being trained on what the processes are, right? How often are you asking your patients? Are you doing it every time they walk in the door? Are you doing it once every 3 months or once every 6 months? When you look at the demographic screen in the EMR, what field tells you that this patient belongs to that particular physician? And for those of you who are actually in the clinics, you know that there are various different ways of doing that, right? So is everybody on the same page about that? Does everybody agree that's the way we should do it? So this really takes you through all the things that you need to do for that particular activity, with hopefully a little bit of space to do some extra documentation if you want to. So it's a great tool for orienting new staff and, again, making sure that everybody is on the same page within the clinic. There's a couple of different ways you can go about this. In some clinics, they just print off the whole document. It's about 64 pages long. And each activity has its own page. So, for example, in one of my clinics, they love the idea of having the book they can flip around in, so they print out the whole book. Okay, but there's some of these clinics that maybe get a little overwhelmed, right? And they're like, oh, I don't want to know about those. I can only focus on this right now. We're too busy. So in some cases, I might actually just print out, page number 12 for that activity, and I take it into the clinic and say, okay, here's what we're working on this month, right? Or here's going to be what we're going to talk about in our next sort of team meeting. So you can see where you think this would be better used within that particular clinic. If they're really, really excited and they want to kind of go whole hog, then bring in the whole thing and let them choose. Or just guide them on one activity at a time on your own. Okay? So that just gives you an overview of the documents themselves, how they can be used, the ways in which you can use them, and how they've come about. So I'll just pause there for a second. Anything you might want to add, Lori and Carrie?
Sure, yeah, just with respect to the workbook, you mentioned, or we talked about the checklist and having a lot of applications at different levels in the primary care networks and at the clinic level, and that the toolkit was really aimed at improvement facilitators, so to be able to go and get the resources that they would need to complete an activity and figure out that output. Similarly, when this workbook was written, it was meant to be used with a clinic who has an improvement facilitator, and you'll see that as you go through the document about engaging your improvement facilitator to do the work. But we also wrote it knowing that not every clinic has that resource. So in some of your PCNs, if you're under-resourced and you have those clinics that are higher functioning, it is meant to be provided, or it can be provided to a clinic. And we hope that there's just enough background and information in those introductions and enough instruction in those exercises that some clinics could actually do this work self-directed as well.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Thank you, Lori. Okay, so I'm just wondering, is it a good thing to maybe pause and ask if there's any questions from the attendees? The next section, what I want to do is just sort of delve into the actual activities themselves on the checklist. Does anybody want to just type out a message or unmute themselves and ask anything before we kind of dive into those line by line?
Yeah, good question. Let's give people a chance. It does take some time to unmute. So let's just pause for a few minutes here. And then looking forward to delving in with you, Mia. Okay, it sounds like we can move forward, which is great. Thanks for pausing there for a minute, and let's go deep.
Oh, sorry. Yes, this is Maureen with the High Level Medical Clinic. One of the issues that we're coming up is actually getting the doctor's approval or buy-in for some of our items. So how do we are there resources to say, present it to your physician this way or that way in order to get buy-in to kind of accelerate their decision-making process?
I think that sometimes it depends on somewhat with your PCN. So, for example, what I have noticed is that in some PCNs, it's a little bit more directive. Say, okay, this is what we're going to work on as a PCN, and we're going to move forward. Like in my PCN, for example, we talk about we want to work on a minimum of 5 of the ASAP screens, right? And the clinics can choose to do more than that, but we have a minimum of 5 that we ask them to do. And so when it comes to getting a bit of buy-in or engagement with the doctors, if you haven't got that, or if you find that that's just not something that you're doing within your particular PCN, then I am always looking for anything that might be of value to them. And so just to kind of give you an example, so just thinking in my brain here. So I've gone into clinics before, and this is maybe a little bit more of an advanced activity, but I would go into their EMR and I would say, okay, I'll run just a very quick list without even kind of showing anybody, and I'll just pull a list and say, give me a list of all the diabetics who haven't had their A1C done in greater than 6 months, right? And so I pull that list for them and I show it to the doctors and I say, So I pulled you a list out of your EMR, just for giggles. I showed you what was, kind of getting spit out. And I said, is this something you would like? And they're like, oh, this is awesome. And they could look at that and say, oh, that person passed away. Oh, okay, so maybe we need to do a little bit of, paddling work around that. Maybe there's some updating that needs to be done. And then I might say, okay, well, would you like this like this? Would you like to be able to follow up with people more often, make sure that they're being compliant in their care? Would you like to do, how would you like to phone in all your people who are overdue for their PAPs and mammograms? And generally, every physician will nod their head and go, yeah, I'd really like that. And then I start the conversation about, okay, well, in order to get that, here's what we need to be able to do in order to get that information out of the EMR, right? So I really tend to always not focus on what the PCN needs or wants. I try to make it so that it's a value or an advantage to them. And then after I sort of get, okay, I'd like that. Oh, okay, well, the PCN would like that too. And then, by the way, I'll collect this for the PCN while I'm at it. So does that answer your question?
Definitely.
That will work
for sure. Mia, I really like that. It's Carrie here. I really like your answer. I do think that you've got to keep it clinically meaningful. It's the panel management part, it's the screening part that Mia is going to go over next week that really excites physicians. It has to be meaningful work, meaningful to them and to patients. And sometimes you do have to work backwards where you show that meaningful part and then say, and that requires X, Y, Z to do it. So lovely answer. Thanks for sharing that, Mia.
No problem. And now that's just, my answer about how I often go about it. But sometimes you have unique challenges. And with the Equip team, we are trying to create, and I'll just give a little plug here, we're trying to create sort of a community of practice of improvement facilitators so that if you come up with particular struggles, you have the ability to reach out to other people doing similar work and say, look, I've got this one doctor, and God, I can't get this to move forward. Anybody got any ideas? And then you can have sort of a forum to be able to ask those kinds of questions and get input from other people doing the same kind of work, or maybe they've had the same kinds of challenges. So, Carrie or Lori, did you want to pipe up? Because I know there's an Equip team sort of in the works of being formed for Northern Alberta, and what we're hoping is that will help give you a format or a forum to be able to do that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Yes, exactly. Go ahead, Lori.
Oh, I was just going to say we can for sure shamelessly plug here, and we have our colleagues. I know Sue and Sandy, our improvement advisors in the Edmonton area, are on the line. I saw your name. I'm not sure if any of our other colleagues from up north are here. But I don't know, Sue or Sandy, if you wanted to chime in, you can take the opportunity now.
Sure, I'd be happy to. This is Sue Peters, and we are actively working to create a community of practice in the northern part of the province, and you will be hearing more about this in the very near future. We're very excited about it, and we will definitely be including making the opportunity for those IFs in the northern part of the province. And then what we're hoping will happen is that there will be smaller groups that will form as part of that larger community of practice. And one of them may be an Equip team for the north, because the Equip team, you guys have done some amazing work together, and we're just so very impressed and are really excited about the opportunity that we have to do some similar work in the north. So kudos to you guys. You've done a great job. So thank you.
That's fabulous. So, one of the other things that I would love to say as well is that a lot of the people who are currently on the Equip team in the Calgary area, a lot of the people at that table are really, want to make these processes and these things that we do deal with on a daily basis. We want to help people with that, and so whether it be with a Northern equipped team or the Calgary equipped team, I'm sure what I'm hoping we're going to flesh out just a little bit better. But I can speak for myself. I can't speak for everybody, but for myself, if anybody wanted to call and just pick a brain and say, I just got this problem, I need to talk it out, or I need to ask some questions, and what have you experienced? Then hopefully we can create that community of practice so that we have the ability to do that. And so I think that's also really exciting because we really typically haven't had that. Way back in the day when I was clinic managing 3 clinics of my own, I really had nobody to go to, really. And at the time, PCNs didn't have really improvement facilitators in the way that they are right now. And so in my clinics, I'd be like, I don't really know how to deal with this, or I don't know how to fix this in the EMR, or I'm not getting any response from my vendor, or and so we were always sort of in a little silo trying to evolve things on our own without some outside input. And having people you can go to and talk to is just incredibly valuable. So, Lori, maybe what I'll do is, can we go back over to the checklist?
Sure.
And then what we'll do is we'll dive into that, those activities.
Yep, I can definitely go back there, but I just want to let you know that we did have a question from the audience. And I thought it would be relevant to everybody on the line, so wanted to address it with everyone. And that question is, do we have to go through the whole list items one by one, or only the ones that we are concerned about? So I think it's just, do we need to go through the whole checklist? Do we need to work on the whole workbook? So I'll let you address that, Mia.
Okay, so great question. So I think if you, for example, we did have, when we were test driving this with a couple of other clinics, I know that one of the fellows who took it out to a fairly advanced clinic, they, in terms of, you really do want to meet them where they're at, right? Because what we know is that the clinics don't have a lot of time. Sometimes I always tell people that, what kind of work do you do? And I say, well, I'm always working with physicians in between patients, in between phone calls and while they're eating. And so I think really you have to make the best use of your time. So if you know that this clinic is really advanced, then, for your own sort of knowledge and peace of mind, and maybe even for your PCN supports, going through the checklist and doing like a tick, 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 tick for yourself would be really useful, because you actually might notice and say, oh, they're really advanced, but geez, they don't do this little beginning step. That's really interesting. I wonder if they want to kind of circle back and do that one. But if they're kind of advanced, I would say let's not walk them through the first part of that workbook. By doing your little tick, 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 tick and your only little assessment on the checklist, then you can go to that activity in the workbook and say, okay, here's where I think you guys are at. Do you agree or disagree, right? And hopefully you'll get agreement. And if you don't, that's a whole other conversation. But if you find that they're sort of at a certain spot and you can say, okay, here's where I think is the next step for you, then maybe you want to pull out that, those couple of activities out of the workbook and say, okay, if you want to sort of take it up a notch, then maybe let's go to try this. So hopefully that answers your question. I would say if you think they're really advanced, don't go through all the basic stuff with them. However, as a facilitator, again, actually I didn't mention this at the beginning, but one of the things that I find useful is that as I'm getting to know my clinics and as I'm building relationships, I have a checklist and I have a workbook for all of my clinics. And then they have their own copies of that. But at any point, because I have 20 of my own clinics I'm looking at, I can say, oh, I forgot, what maneuvers were they working on? And, how were they actually marking their inactive patients versus walk-in versus, and then I can look back on those notes and say, oh, right. So in some ways it's a good reference for me, but maybe not necessarily effective to take the clinic themselves through that workbook right from start to finish. So hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, we got a thumbs up, Mia.
Oh, okay, good.
Thanks so much.
It's so hard. It's so hard when you don't, it's a one-way conversation. Okay, all right. So going back to the checklist, what I would like to do is we're going to go through that first page. Again, page 2 we're going to do next week. So that really gives you a lot of foundational knowledge about the documents themselves and sort of what's contained in all of this. So here's where we sort of get into the where the rubber meets the road. So I'm going to just go through each individual activity, and please feel free to throw questions into the chat space or unmute yourself and stop me. I want to make sure that we allow enough time for people to ask questions later on if something didn't make sense to them. So again, please just stop me if you need to. So activity number 1, well, sorry, I shouldn't say number 1 because if you notice they are not numbered. Again, pointing to the fact that this is not necessarily linear. Also, you don't have to do 1 to do number 2, and you don't have to do number 2 to do number 3. Okay, so these are just sort of things that we think in level 1 they're beginning level activities, right? And then the things in level 2 are things that we can build on from all the stuff that we're doing in level 1. So the very first one says determine active patients that are attached to a primary care provider. So what we're doing with this one, again, these are pretty straightforward at the beginning stages. We just want to know, have you gone and discussed your process within the clinic? Have you written it down, hopefully in the workbook or elsewhere? Have you got a solid process to identify who is attached to that doctor? Okay. So if you, I'm just trying to give you some examples here. So in one of my clinics, when I have gone in and said, okay, so, here, I got a good example. Okay, sorry, pulling this off the top of my head. So I have one clinic who has been around for like 20 years. And so they really have, if you go into their EMR and you pull a list of anybody attached to this one of those, I'm sorry, stuttering, let me slow down. If you pull a list of all the patients attached to that physician, I'll get 20,000 people. Now, that's not an actual representation of his panel because he's been practicing so long that he's had so many people come through his practice. So he actually had all of these people assigned to him, but they had no other way to determine if they were a walk-in versus somebody who was there 8 years ago, if they were inactive, if they had left the practice, if they belonged to a lodge. None of that stuff was really done within the EMR. All they ever did was attach those patients to that doctor. And so as a result, in order to figure out what his actual panel was, we had to do a lot of work in order to go through all those patients. And as a result, this particular clinic that had 5 physicians went through every single physician panel and cleaned everything up, making sure everybody had appropriate statuses and so forth. Second activity down are the roles and responsibilities are outlined and assigned for panel identification. Okay? So this refers to the output would be, can you create a job description saying it's this person's job to do this when that person walks in the door, or it's this person's job to run lists every so often and clean up people who haven't been there in greater than 3 years. So have you actually had that conversation? And I would say in probably 50% of the clinics that I've spent time in, there's a lot of assumptions that get made. And they think, oh, well, the office manager does that. And, oh, well, that's that person's job. And, oh, that's not my job, right? And I'm a big fan of having everybody work as a team. So I really try to ensure that all the people who are doing, who touch that work, especially around paneling, everybody is on the same page. Yes, I know that person does it, but I do it too. And maybe we all do it in the same, hopefully we all do it in the same way, that this person doesn't record it one way and I record it a different way. In the toolkit, just worth mentioning that there's a panel maintenance tool, which is in Appendix B of one of the top documents. Thanks, Lori, for doing that. I was just going to give it a shout out. But there's an actual link. I think it'll be on page 4 of the toolkit. I'll just quickly point out this particular one.
Yeah, it's in the guide to panel identification.
There we go. So if you notice, there's that activity roles and responsibilities are outlined, the second one down. Guide to panel ID, Appendix B, panel maintenance tool. And so, look at Lori go. Carol. Okay. So it'll link you right to that particular tool. We'll just let that.
There we go.
Everybody can see it on the screen. Okay, and this actually might be familiar to a lot of people. On the left-hand side, you can see here, right? So for some clinics, if you really think that this is a big problem for these guys, or that maybe not everybody's on the same page, even just having like a lunchtime meeting with your clinic and actually going through each one of these things and saying, okay, who actually enters that, right? Who actually books the meet and greet? And then how do you do that? And then if the person gets accepted into the practice, then who actually updates it so that they're now an active patient? Like what is really, really the fine detail of who does what, when, and how? Okay. And then of course, assign responsibilities for that. Ideally, it always drove me a little bit crazy when some clinics, some reception staff in the clinic would say, well, that's her job, but it's not my job. Or I work for that doctor. I don't work for this doctor, right? So you've got all kinds of iterations of how people create their workflows in the clinic. And so it doesn't matter if you don't work for that doctor. You still want to panel people the same way. And because you're still working on the same EMR, so you want your processes to be as close as possible so that you get good data coming out down the road. Thanks, Lori, for showing that. Did you want to go back to the checklist? Okay. Here's activity down in level 1.
Mia, can I just chime in here? It's Sue. For those of you that the checklist may look a little small on your screen, there's a way to zoom your screen on GoToMeeting. And the way you get to that is if you click on that yellow button that's or the orange button by the your control center for GoToMeeting, that will hide the control panel, get it out of your way so that it will show the zoom feature, and then you can zoom to any size you want. And once I made mine bigger, it was a lot easier to see the different items on the screen. So, thanks.
Thanks, Sue. Okay, perfect. So third activity down under level 1 is EMR configurations and settings are managed by one or more clinic staff. Okay, so again, I'm just going to try and give you as many examples from clinics of my own, is that sometimes you have just the office manager who has administrative permissions, right? And in some clinics, everybody's got administrative settings on their own logins. So who actually does that? Who manages the settings? I can't tell you how many times I've gone into a clinic and said, okay, well, this person, everybody does all the settings, but then maybe something needs to be changed, and they change it, but don't tell everybody else. And they're, oh, we didn't know that status was there, and even though they look at it every day. Or maybe it might be that somebody was using that status for something very specific, like one of my clinics has an occupational health and safety status. And what will happen is that the person who does changing of the settings will go in and say, oh, why do we have that? We don't need that. And they get rid of it, and then everybody panics, right? So who is that person who is sort of managing that? And are they actually having conversations? If there's any changes being made, are they sharing it with the team? Who's the person who's going to make those changes? Have you documented who that person is? Like if you have a new staff member coming on, is that person, who is the person you need to go to in order to make a change? So those are the questions that you're kind of asking. The fourth activity down says patient statuses are defined, configured, and shared with the team. Okay? So statuses. For those of you working really in depth in the EMR, each EMR is a little bit different. Most of those statuses those drop-down menus are configurable. Again, you're going to want to know who that person is who can actually make the changes. Has everybody agreed to what those statuses need to be? Okay. Often the EMR will come up with a list of statuses that come outside, like I call it, they come out of the box with the EMR when you load it up. But not everybody knows that you can configure that. For example, one of my clinics had a lot of lodge patients. They didn't want to include them in their panel because these are patients that they physically went out to the lodge to go see. And so they wanted to kind of treat them a little bit differently. They didn't want their staff calling and saying, hey, you're overdue for your mammogram, why don't you come on in? So they wanted to really separate that out, and they had no idea that they could configure that status, those set of statuses. So have you agreed to that list? Have they been configured the way you want them? And does everybody on the team know them and know how to assign those statuses appropriately? So again, going back to the the workbook, you can actually document a lot of that stuff in the workbook. The fifth activity down is patient panel lists for each provider is available internally to the clinic team. So, are you able to actually run a list of your patients for each physician produced out of your EMR? Okay. Now, just that one simple step of actually running that list out of your EMR will give you a wealth of information. For example, in my clinic that had the 20-year-old practice, when I ran a list, and he'd say, "Oh yeah, I think I've got I don't know, maybe 5,000 patients," right? So I said, "Okay, the way your EMR looks right now, when I pull you a list, it says you have 20,000. And he'd be like, God, I can't take care of 20,000 people. Well, of course not. We have to figure out what your panel is and your active people coming to see you. Or it could be the other way around, right? You might say, the physician might say something like, I have a lot of physicians who say, I think I got like 3,000 people. And you pull a list and there's like maybe 1,500, right? And they're like, what? I thought I had way more than that. So often what the physicians think they have versus what they actually have can be create quite a bit of awareness with where they're at. And it'll also indicate to them the question that we had earlier, when you can't get engagement from the physicians. And you say, okay, so if I'm sometime down the road, if we're going to, work more on the ASAP stuff, and I need to run a rate out of all the mammograms that you currently have on file for your active patients, right now your rate is going to look terrible because, we've got patients, 20,000 patients, but your panel is more like 1,500. So we only want to report on the 1,500. We don't want to report on all your walk-in patients or those people you haven't seen in 10 years. So, if we do some work around the panel, we can really clean that up and start to really target the people who are actively seeing you right now, right? And that, again, is really helpful to explain to the docs, because when you walk in and say, okay, we got to clean up your panel, they're like, why? That's extra work. We don't want to do that. It costs time. It costs money. It costs resources. So really linking everything back to how that's going to impact them later on would be really works well, I find. Okay, the last one under level 1 is a standardized process for. Sorry?
We've got another question.
Oh,
so I'm just going to quickly interject and have you answer this one, and that is this for all EMRs, including paper?
So I would answer and say that my brain tends to go really fast when I get questions. So with most EMRs, you can do a list of some kind out of your EMR. Now, I'm just going to point out that if you go to the top EMR tip sheets, Top has done a fantastic job of really going, like you can pull up, for example, if your clinic is on Accuro, they have a tip sheet that's just for Accuro. If you're on Wolf, then they've got one just for Wolf. So all those things about configuring statuses and being able to run a provider list, a lot of that stuff is all contained in there. So if you're trying to guide the clinic through what they need to do, then some of that information is going to be available through the tip sheet. If you have a clinic that is on paper, really there's no clinics, actually, correction, there's one clinic that I'm aware of who actually somehow is not billing electronically. And there's various reasons for that. But anyways, most clinics have to submit their billing electronically, which means using an EMR of some kind. So even for those of us who've been around for a long, long time, there's old programs out there like MedTech, okay, which is like DOS-based. And there's still some capability out of most of them to run lists. If there's something, if there's an EMR that you're, there's even some clinics who have EMRs that they've ordered software out of the States that it's something I've never heard of before. You really kind of need to investigate that particular piece of software and find out if it's even possible. And because if it isn't, then that's something that your PCN would likely want to know, or whoever your ED might be, and just say, look, I can't even run a list out of this. And then the doctors might want to know that as well. They say, I really can't help inform you about what your panel looks like because this piece of software doesn't even do that, right? So it's a limitation of the software that you have. So again, I would just say, depending on which piece, I don't know which piece of software EMR that that clinic is using, but refer to the top tip sheets and see if there's actually something there that you can refer to.
For sure, I'll just chime in, Mia, as we were writing this. There's definitely, if you look at each line, and you refer back to the tip sheets, not every EMR does every function. As most of you in the audience are probably nodding in agreement. So when we look at things like patient statuses are configured, not every EMR has the ability to do that. But we do describe what those workarounds are to the best of our ability. So this was written in what we call EMR agnostic fashion. So it is meant to be independent of whatever EMR you are on. But it is definitely written with the intention that clinics would have an EMR. And you'll see there as you look through the toolkit and as you look through the workbook, many of the activities are EMR related. So it would be up to your expertise and your artistic creativity as an improvement facilitator if you were going to adapt this to a paper clinic. So we know that there are several activities that paper clinics can do successfully. However, things like point of care reminders, as you flip into the second page, aren't going to work. So the paper piece will be left to your creativity. And to the best of our ability, we've tried to describe how this could be done in the 6 most used EMRs here in Alberta.
Perfect. And then maybe 2 other things worth mentioning is either with the North or the South equipped teams, there's a lot of people who know somebody who's like a super user for that particular EMR. So you might want to find somebody who is either currently a super user or is able to help guide you in some of that and say, oh yeah, I've seen that at EMR before, and here's what we did in this clinic, and this kind of worked, but it'll only work if that information is in that field, right? So it requires a little bit more legwork to do some research around that. But hopefully, as time goes on, we're going to have more resources that you can reach out to. Not including the vendors, which you certainly can, but sometimes having people who are doing the improvement facilitator work is just that really gives you more of a clinical connection to the software and how things relate and where data gets entered. So hopefully that answers the question. Okay, so I'll go to the next activity. So the 5th one down here in panel level 1 is a standardized process for patient validation is established and documented. A validation rate is produced and shared with the team. Okay, so basically with this particular activity, you've got a process in place. You're able to actually run a rate out of the EMR. Okay, so that means, and again, the PCNs may differ on how they do the rates. You can do like a quarterly rate or an annual rate or a panel rate. So the workbook will help guide you through some of that. All the formulas for numerators, denominators are also in the workbook. And so you can work through that, but just in very simplistic fashion. For example, if you were doing a panel rate, you would say, okay, how many people walked in the door who were seen by this physician within 3 years? And then of that number of patients, your numerator would be how many of those have been validated or verified or confirmed. There's that varying language through the province. And so then from there, you do it like you did in high school, right? I got 15 out of 20 on my test. So I, have validated 15 out of 20 of the people who walked in the door. So that gives me a rate of X percent. Okay? And then also that we share that with the team. I don't want to underestimate that because I really do prefer that in the clinics. For me personally, I love the idea of the entire clinic working as a team and that they don't silo themselves off individually within the clinic. And so if you can say, okay, for this clinic, for ABC Clinic, we have a validation rate of 56%. And then we're gonna check in 3 months and see if it's better, and yay! And we have some cheerleading, and maybe sometimes even the clinics will say, okay, if we can do this, then everybody gets a free Starbucks, right? So you can incent them however you wish and whatever makes sense to them, but sort of get a little bit of excitement happening about everybody kind of getting on the same page and making that rate a little bit better. Some of our clinics are real cheerleaders. They put their rate up in their lunchroom, and they compare it like once a month or weekly even. Some of them will do it once every 3 months, which is a great quality improvement measure, or they'll do it in conjunction with a panel rate as well, which gives them kind of an overall rate. Okay, panel ID level 2. So by this point, once you've got those things done in level 1, you're pretty equipped to do the stuff in level 2. So patient panel lists are regularly produced for each primary care provider, and that interval can be determined by the clinic or the PCN or yourself for that matter. We want to share that internally. So are we sharing that with the physicians? Are we saying, okay, guess what, doc, you've got X amount of patients. I had one physician, two physicians who, once we actually cleaned up their panel and we knew how many patients they actually had, they reopened their practice to invite more patients because he thought he had 2,000 patients when he really only had 800. And he's like, oh, well, I think maybe I have a lot more capacity to do that. So I was kind of suspecting that, but I really didn't know for sure. So he opened up his practice. He's now taking more patients. So, and then also, you want to take those lists and maybe once a month you sit down with your team in the clinic and you want to look them over, right? You just want to kind of cast your eyes over that. A lot of the people at reception, they know all these people. So you could look at the list, and even if it's kind of long, you could look at it and say, oh, I know that these 5 people passed away, right? Or I know that, this person here on the list, these are children, so we shouldn't be phoning them. We should make sure we have contact information for the parents. Or there's a lot of things you can do, even just by running your eyeballs over those lists and making sure that that's accurate, especially if you're doing a lot of cleanup, because your numbers are going to change quite a bit. Okay. The second activity under level 2, conduct EMR searches to actively clean the panel. Okay, so this one is all about using some of the functions within your EMR to be able to clean up that panel. You're not just doing it when people are presenting and walking in the door. You're actually running a list that might be something like, give me a list of all the patients who haven't been in this clinic in more than 3 years. And then you start reviewing that list and say, oh yeah, we haven't seen them in 10. Oh, that person's got to come off, or that person passed away. I need to update, they're now deceased. So you can actually start using your EMR to create searches that will inform how you clean up your panel. Okay. For example, I have a walk-in clinic. I love this example. I don't know. I just love sharing this one. I have a walk-in clinic who we did a list in their EMR because in Wolf you can do occurrences in there. And so I run a list for them every 6 months or so saying, how many patients have we seen in walk-in in the last 1 year, and how many of them have had 3 or more visits to the same doctor? Meaning this person is actually coming and now seeing the doctor kind of on a regular basis because they have walk-in and family practice, but nobody's actually attached them. So they actually get a list, and now they can actually phone those people and say, hey, we've noticed you've been kind of coming to our clinic fairly regularly. Just wanted to know if you wanted to make Dr. So-and-so your regular family doctor. And so now they're actively attaching patients who were formerly walk-ins, but it's much more mindful than it used to be, and not kind of based on when you happen to catch them at the front desk. Okay, next activity. Patient demographics, provider assignment, or status definitions are updated as a result of the EMR cleanup searches. Now, in this particular case, when you're getting lists like that, and you're actually running off these lists, for example, all those people who haven't been seen in greater than 3 years, it's great that you're running the list, but first of all, can you run the list? Do you know what those searches look like? Do you know how to run some really creative searches? There's some basic ones you could do, but there's some really creative ones you could do, right? The list of anybody who hasn't been seen in greater than 3 years, that's a really good kind of broad stroke search. But the one with the walk-in clinic where you're matching up people who have been in 3 or more times in the past year, who haven't been assigned, that's a very specific search and a little bit more complex. So are you really familiar with how to do that in that EMR, right? So getting familiar with your EMR and just getting more knowledge about how to build the searches in a really effective way. That was kind of that first activity. Now, the second activity is, what are you doing with those lists? Are you actually doing a lot of active cleanup with them? Are you taking that list and changing statuses? Are you cleaning up physicians? Are you making sure that you're coming up with physicians who haven't practiced in that clinic for 10 years, but they're seeing the doctor that's there now currently? Is all that stuff being cleaned up as you go? Okay, and some of that you'll do like in your team meetings. So you can discuss that a little bit more as you clean up. Next activity, for patients seen within the last 3 months, patient validation rate is greater than 90%, and the results are shared with the team. Okay. Now, what I want to point out is that in this particular activity, The number, sort of the fifth one, wait, that's not 5, that's number 6 under level 1, and then the fourth one down on level 2, and then you're also going to see the third one down on level 3. They all connect with each other. So the beginning activity would be, can you actually create a process and pull a rate out of your EMR? By the time you get to level 2, what we want to know is that process is going well and it's consistent. So within the last 3 months, what is your validation rate for the people who have walked in the door? Is it greater than 90%, right? And they might take time to get through that, to be able to get to that level, right? By the time you get to level 3, we want to know that not only people walked in the door in the last 3 months, which is a quality improvement measure, we want to know out of your entire panel, is your validation rate greater than 90%? And for a lot of clinics, that's a tall order, especially the ones that have been around for a long, long time and require a lot of cleanup. So that's why we consider that advanced, because you would have had to have really invested a lot of time and effort to get to that point. However, I've got clinics who just started out and they validated right off the bat, and they're all sitting in the 90s because that's how they started off their process, right? So again, you're going to meet them where they're at. Panel identification level 3. These are much more advanced activities. Research, compare, and discuss the value and use of available external reports. That means reports coming that are not out of your EMR to inform quality improvement and patient care. The provider, which is generally the physician, he or she is the one who applies for these reports and can receive ones that he can choose to receive. So this activity is all about, and you can see on the output side, these are some of the examples. You can order some of these reports, and it all gives you different information. So you might want to sit down as a team and say, okay, we'd like to kind of go to the next level. So, for example, some of the Alberta Health reports or HQCR reports will give you an idea about how many patients who are doctoring with you, but then they're doctoring somewhere else, or they're really going out to emerge an awful lot to do things that could be done within the family practice, right? So are they using the resources or the health system appropriately, right? So again, this is very advanced. You kind of want to have your panel in really good order before you get to something like this. The next activity is based on selected external reports. So once you kind of looked at those reports, you have goals and actions for improvements are planned and assigned, right? So you're doing an actual quality improvement activity now. You're saying, okay, based on what we know from this report compared to what we know in our EMR, we see a gap here, or we're seeing that 30% of our patients are going out to emerge too much. What are we going to do about that? Do we want to create a communication plan, or do we have a strategy, or does the doctor even want to do anything about it, or it could really be anything. So do you want to have that conversation about what you're going to do? The third one down on level 3, during the last 3 years, that the validation rate for the entire panel was greater than 90%, and then shared with the team. The panel report indicates the current validation rate and the rate tracked over time. So by this point, you would have been doing this for a while. You might have it up in your lunchroom saying, okay, we started out at this percent, we grew this over 6 months, now our panel rate's this, and right? And so you want to sort of see that there's some improvement over time. I have one clinic who thought for sure that they were validating things extremely well. And while I was sitting there, without giving them any time to think about it, I said, okay, let's run a rate right now. And they're like, And I ran the rate, it was 11%. So only 11% of the people walking in the door were getting validated or were having anything done in terms of updating their demographic screen or confirming their current address and phone number. And so that was really powerful for that clinic because they really thought they were high functioning. And when you show them that the data shows otherwise, then it sort of lights a fire a little bit to say, okay, we really need to make that better because we don't want to be like this all the time. This particular clinic also was my clinic that's been around for a long time, and so they thought that they were, again, one of the higher functioning clinics, and so they were shocked to realize that they weren't able to produce that. Okay, and last activity. Expertise is demonstrated by independently conducting quality improvement activities based on internal and external reports and unique clinic traits. Now, this one's a little bit more vague, but what we're trying to aim for here is that you've got your panel really well in hand, and not only are you looking at outside sources of information to help you validate and make sure that you have a clean panel, But now you're starting to create things that are a little bit more unique to the clinic. So just as an example, we have a lot of clinics in Northeast Calgary that deal with immigration, or I have one clinic that does like aviation medicals. So now that you're doing a lot of work around panel, what are some of the things that are really unique about your clinic that maybe you want to focus on, right? You want to focus on anybody who speaks a certain language and make sure that everybody's been attended to, they don't need anything. You want to make sure that you're, paneling people from a certain country. Like, you could really, this is a point for you to be able to create your own quality improvement activities that will be meaningful to you, and likely that the clinic can guide themselves on. And so, is that meaningful? Or, maybe by that point you're like, okay, we're good. And maybe this is as far as we want to take it. So that's sort of left to you to say, okay, sky's the limit. Now, what do you want to do after all that? So, wow, I've been talking nonstop. So what I would really love to do is open up the call for questions. If anybody has any question about any particular activity or the levels or why something was done the way it was, please feel free to throw anything out there.
Sure. And I also have a question, Mia, on the chat here. And that question is, can you please give clarity to establishing a validation rate?
Establishing a validation rate. Okay. So for a validation rate, what I want to know, I'll just give you the example for myself, and you can vary this a little bit. But in my clinics, in all 20 of my clinics, sorry, let me clarify, because I do have one paper clinic, and we haven't got them totally sorted out yet. But in all my clinics, I do 2 measures on every clinic. So every 3 months, I pull a 3-month rate, and I pull a panel rate. So again, the workbook actually puts all these formulas out there so that you can have a closer look at what those formulas actually are. But first of all, they have to have a process in place, some way that I can report it. So, for example, it might be that, for example, in Wolf, there's a little tick box that they have to do in the demographics screen that actually indicates that they have actually done specific things. They have checked their current demographics, and they have asked the patient and said, okay, do you consider Dr. So-and-so your regular family doctor? If they've gone through that process, they tick that off, that means they have been validated. So now in the EMR, I'm going to go and I'm going to say, okay, of the number of people who've walked in the door in the last 3 months, how many of those people have been verified? So I can actually, so I'm going to go in the EMR, I'm going to say how many people actually had a visit within that 3-month period of time. And then my numerator is going to be how many of those patients have actually been verified in the EMR. And that will give me my rate.
And Sharon, Mia, I've got the activity and panel identification level 1 up there, so you'll be able to see that there's a little bit more of an explanation. And so we've got that activity in more than one level. So this is the activity that's in level 1. And if I scroll forward, just stop me if I'm gone too far. Patient validation rate there's the activity there. So there's information on why you're doing that activity, and then there's the actual exercise that guides you through that. And there's also more information in the top tip sheets, EMR specific, about how to get those numerators and denominators in each of the systems.
Right, exactly. So the workbook is going to take you through the how-to, and then the toolkit is going to give you the links to the toolkits, or the tip sheets that will give you a little bit more of the how-to that's vendor specific, as well as some additional explanation around it.